The following program is presented by the National Committee on United States-China Relations, www.ncuscr.org.
Celebration of the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and on that night, the night before, Wen Jiabao hosted a dinner. And it was not a small, intimate affair. I think, Robert, about 5,000 people, about 500 tables and 10 people. Well, I had the fortune of being seated next to one, Robert Lawrence Kuhn. And so I started talking with him, and he told me that he had done this biography of Jiang Zemin, and I had remembered the biography. And as we talked more and more, I realized that this was, this person with a PhD in neuroscience, and a life as a investment banker, and now a writer, and it was quite a kind of a man for all seasons story. So he then told me he was coming out with this new book, How China Leaders Think. So I said, well, the National Committee would be a perfect venue for you to talk about it. And so we are thrilled to have him here, and I've actually been through the book, and it's a serious read, but it's probably from a China expert's perspective. I guess our ambassador says China expert's an oxymoron, but from somebody who spends a lot of time looking at China, it's the access to the leadership that Dr. Kuhn has is simply extraordinary. I really am not aware of another foreigner. There are Chinese who have that level of access, but the access that he has to the leadership, the discussions that he has, when you look at the acknowledgments, it's like you're checking off Politburo members, and then you're checking off ministers, and then you're checking off governors.
And getting the order right. Boy,
right, that was, but it was party order. You used party order.
A lot of people going over that, to be sure.
Absolutely. And then stories of Hu Jintao's father during the Cultural Revolution, which is something which is worth reading. Jiang Zemin's visit to the United States. It takes you kind of beneath what you read in the U.S. media and gives you a real interesting look at China, and is really a worthwhile read. The criticisms will be that, in order to have that access, you're not tough enough on the Chinese, and I'm sure you'll address that in your comments. But with no further ado, let me turn it. We're thrilled to have you, and let me turn it over to Dr. Kuhn.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to such a distinguished group of people who really know China and really are rooting for China in the best possible way, because the world is in a complicated situation. We all know that, and China is a critical and a major player, and the work of the National Committee under Stephen has never been more important than it is today. So I appreciate everyone being here, and I like learning more than I speak, so I'm going to try to speak maybe a little bit less than I would to an audience that is less knowledgeable, and then look forward to your questions and interacting, because there'll be a lot of things that you have in mind that we would love to talk about. I'd like to sort of give you some of my current thinking to give you some flavor. People are interested in the process of the book or some of the criticisms. I love to talk about that, so I'll leave that for the Q&A session. But the thing that I've tried to focus on is the fact that in today's world, China is absolutely essential for the stability, peace, and prosperity of the world, and China, because of its system, is so dependent upon its leaders. And so what I've tried to do is, in this historic transformation that China has gone through in the last 30 years, 31 years since the beginning of reform and opening up, how to trace the thinking of China's leaders and how do they think. This is something that I've really enjoyed focusing on and to really get through. And I really, it really came about when I was doing the biography of President Jiang, and I met one individual, which I'll give credit to. Many of you probably don't know him. He's a minister he runs right now. He was the executive vice minister of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and now is running the party literature office. His name is Lung Rong, and he was the expert on Deng Xiaoping theory. And when I first met him, maybe 10 years ago, in writing the biography of President Zhang, he gave me sort of some schooling in Chinese political theory, from Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, and then what later became, at that point, Sangha Daibiao, the three representatives of Jiang Zemin, and then later on, Kushui Fazhangguan, scientific perspective of development, which to our ears normally is almost meaningless. It's like nonsense syllables that are fed to the masses, and even people who study China really don't pay that much attention to it. But as I first saw that, I began to realize that these political theories were what they were superficially, but they actually reflect some very deep political thinking, political struggling, conflict, and all sorts of things that you could begin to trace. So that was sort of my awakening to how to think about how the leaders think. People ask me, well, you say how the leaders think. That's what they tell you. You don't know. You don't think they really think that. They're just fooling some impressionable, wide-eyed, white-skinned, pale New Yorker or something. And I try to answer that. And you answer that by, triangulating dozens and dozens of people over protracted periods of time, and not wholly insensitive to the system. As you go higher, people will be less and less scripted on process. And the technique, the one technique that I used, came about it sort of by accident, but that really works in disrupting a leader from their own agenda of what the party line would be at any given moment, which of course changes, is to talk about their personal life, is to have them go back and talk about their parents and where they were in the Cultural Revolution and what happened to them. And suddenly, almost in all cases, you get a breakthrough, because you can't be scripted and talk about what your own experiences were, particularly when you deal with the Cultural Revolution, which so affected virtually anybody that you would speak with in an urban setting today in China. And so when people talk about their own personal lives and their history, and as they've gone forward and they've experienced it, things change, and you really can get deeper into ways of thinking. So we all today know China's situation. Just passed Germany as the world's largest exporter, we just read. It effectively has passed Japan as the number 2 largest economy, certainly by PPP, but maybe even on nominally next year. And of course, we all know all the problems. And so what I try to address is, how do China leaders, generationally, but most important, looking to the future, the next generation, those who are coming to power in 2012, the fall, and then more formally in 2013 for the government, how do they think? What are their attitudes? What are the differences? We were just talking before, but one of the major differences is that if you look at the last 2 generations of Chinese leaders, they were all trained in science and engineers. Jiang Zemin, who would have loved to have been a poet or a writer or a singer, although you don't want to tell him his voice is not quite that good, because that's very important to him. But he would have loved to really been a professor of literature. But he said we had no choice. We had to study science and engineering. We had to build the country. So you had 2 generations of leaders, virtually everyone an engineer. I wrote a piece in Business Week a couple of years ago and made a sort of a semi-joke, and I said maybe the problem between America and China is not that with different cultures, different histories, different political systems. Maybe that's superficial. Maybe the real problem is that China is run by all engineers, America is run by all lawyers. Just lawyers and engineers can't talk to each other. And then to an engineer, every problem is solvable. And to a lawyer, they will engineer into contracts to prevent the most extreme cases. What happens if the most extreme cases occur, which in many cases makes the extreme case more likely to occur. So it is a real different way of thinking. I said that tongue-in-cheek, but really if we look to the next generation, you really have a generational change, and now you have people educated in the social sciences and law, economics, socialized in journalism. So I mean, you have a lot of interesting dynamics that are coming up. I just hope they don't lose the science side. I want to keep, still keep that in as well. So if we look in general at how Chinese leaders think, We can define it domestically, internationally. Domestically, it's obviously improving the standards of living as the number one thing people say and really mean at all levels of leadership. That the party today, and we can talk about democracy, one-party system, because that's something I focus on a lot, that it is extremely important to keep the one-party system, the leaders believe, and I believe that they believe that, not just for personal power. But the difference today is that it's not based really on an ideology that we think the people should follow, but the party has to deliver what the people need, and if they don't, they're going to lose power. I mean, that has been said to me over and over again. So it's a real recognition of that. And, of course, the biggest problems are social imbalances. The Gini index is, has just about exceeded the U.S. in terms of inequality. So we all know the problems, and then corruption and pollution and unsustainable development and all of the traditional issues. Internationally, China is taking its place as one of the great nations of the world, and respectfully so, and intends on that being the case. And the way I express it is that the Chinese leaders feel that in every sphere of human endeavor, whether that's politics, economics, sports, culture, arts, certainly the military, that China should be among those nations at the very top of the list. They do not want it to be at the very top. They don't think it should be the only one. But in every sphere of human endeavor, that China should have it. That's why China has worked very hard to have its corporations. And today, in telecommunications, in banking, in energy, in petrochemicals, China's companies are in the lead. The head of a major bank told me, 8 years ago, he said, some friends from major American banks would come here and tell us what to do, and now I can buy them 10 times over with my market cap. And he didn't say that it was just sort of amazement that this has happened. So that's the important thing. When a Chinese admiral talked about that China will be building an aircraft carrier, the rationale was interesting. He said China will not remain the only great power without an aircraft carrier. That was the justification. And the space program the same way. As poor as China is in some cases, there's almost no criticism of the space program as wasting resources because it's a matter of Chinese pride. So just a couple of observations. In the current situation in China, there really was what I think is a step function difference at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009. And I can pretty much trace, because the leaders that I talk to, I see sometimes a couple of times a year, sometimes less, sometimes more, different levels, different ways, and you can sort of trace feelings and emotions. And I really sensed at that time a significant difference. And that was because the financial crisis at the beginning, and even President Hu said that the best thing China can do for the world during the beginning of the financial crisis is to be left alone. So we have enough problems of our own. We need to solve our own problems. The best thing we can do to solve the financial problems of the world is to solve our own problems and just leave, But in a very few months, the Chinese leaders realized that was impossible, that the world had so changed, which they had not realized, that they can't solve their own problems without being very, very heavily involved in world affairs. So that whereas Chinese leaders would have preferred another 10, 15, 20 years to solve their own domestic problems before sort of emerging in the world, they realized that was impossible, that China would have to become more active and more aggressive immediately. And so it was a step function difference, and the attitude you can see in terms of conversations really changed, and it became more questioning, more aggressive, more worried about what the West was doing vis-a-vis what China. Definitely a new voice. At the same time, there is another trend that is occurring, that one needs to have both of these things to be able to understand current thinking, and that is the run-up to the 18th Party Congress, which will be in the fall of 2012. And so I have several aphorisms about China. A humorous one, which I don't want you to take too seriously, is that the quality of the food is inversely proportional to the price, but that's a separate issue. The more serious aphorism is that power is more related to your next job than your current job. And so you could have fun calculating the half-life of power as people reach a retirement age or expected retirement, and vice versa, an increment as they have an expected promotion. And so right now, as you're within 3 years of a major change where you'll have a full change of the senior leaders and the jockeying for position, that is a short-term trend, but you have to layer that on to this new way of thinking in terms of the financial crisis. The financial crisis has created what I think is a permanent change in thinking, and the run-up to the 18th party was a transitory change in thinking. Now, that's not unusual because every election that I know in American history, that I've lived through, all the politicians tack more nationalistic. We would say tack right in international affairs, not domestic affairs, but international. In China, that's tack left, you understand the difference. So if you get more conservative in China, you're more leftist, and more conservative in America, you're more rightist. So both in elections, you have that nationalistic. It's not so much a political as a nationalistic, patriotic, and is the nicer word, xenophobic, but you have to be a little bit in that way. So as you look at things like how China's dealing with the media, with dissidents, with prison sentences, or dealing with Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, or the Tibet situation, or Taiwan, or any of those issues, you have to look at really both of these trends, or any issue, at the same time interacting. And I would look, and then when you have the new people coming in 2012 and 13, because they will be new, that you have to expect a period of consolidation as well. So I would look for, arguably the next 5 years or so to have a more less flexibility in how the Chinese leadership will be reacting, and this is a difficult time for that. So, I look by the next 5 years as something that, we all need to work to get through, and understanding these kinds of trends, so that everybody, we can deal with this time. After that, I think, I would look for some very positive developments, but, we've got to get through the first, this period of time. So when you think about it, always look about these two issues: the financial crisis having made a permanent change of some kind in all areas, and the political situation being more short-term. I've used a little bit of a framework in the book to kind of capture my understanding of things. I use 4 ideas: pride, stability, responsibility, and vision for how the Chinese leaders think. I was surprised to find a lot of Chinese leaders, when they saw that and read that, thought that was interesting. I didn't think they would think that was that interesting, but they did, because they said they didn't think that way, and that was not something they ever said internally or whatever. But I thought it was an interesting observation for a foreigner to look at it from that perspective. And if you go to the Cultural Revolution and all the things that we know. Some comments about some of the future leaders, which I feel is interesting and worth noting, with Xi Jinping. And we can talk about, as your question is, a lot of politics as we go forward. There's a lot of interesting things about him. One of the most is his father, Xi Jinping, who is really, I think, one of the heroes of reform. I didn't really know much about his name. Deng Xiaoping gets all the credit, and Deng Xiaoping deserves a lot of credit, but not really all the credit. Hu Yaobang played a major role, obviously Zhao Ziyang later on, but Xi Jinping's father really played a very significant role in the beginning of reform in terms of what he did in Guangdong. And what's most amazing is that he was, in one way or another, imprisoned by Mao Zedong for 16 years. Not in a row, but at different times. 16 years, with a house arrest, a full arrest. One time, I think in the 1960s, he made some complimentary comment about a novel, and other people said that novel was subtly critical of Mao, and so that put him in prison. So, and Xi Jinping himself, because of his father, was one of the first to be sent away during the Cultural Revolution. Now, that turned out retrospectively to be actually good for his political career, because if he was, a privileged princeling of a senior leader for his entire life, that would probably have been a negative. But he survived and did very well. He's really the lowest outcast as a teenager, being sent to the most extreme mountainous area during the Cultural Revolution, and did well there. And he also then, after coming back, he spent time, in grassroots, and then in Fujian and in Zhejiang and a little bit in Shanghai. The other thing, most people know there, maybe not everybody here, his wife is a very well-known singer and folk singer, and so it's a very, he has a very interesting background. Obviously, in Zhejiang province, and they had Zhejiang Week here. We helped them do that several years ago. Li Keqiang, you know a lot about him as well, and he ran several provinces. But I have one fact that I have a little personal insight into, which really impressed me. And here's what happened. In 1998, I was doing this PBS series, In Search of China, which, Professor, you was one of our on-camera participants. Thank you very much. We haven't seen each other in a long time. And in that, I interviewed an economist by the name of Li Yining in China, very distinguished. He really created the concept of ownership. And I had a whole CCTV crew with me, and I was there at the behest of senior leaders. It was 1998, and which the government was even stronger at that time. And Li Yining came to, went to his office, and he announced very simply to everybody there, he says, look, I have 1 hour for this interview, and then I'm going, then that's all. And I'm going to leave because I have to have a little something to eat, and then I'm going to teach my class. And teaching my class is more important than being on CCTV in your program than anything else. And, that really impressed me. I thought, here was a guy, I was coming from this, I had, CCTV people, senior leaders, and he didn't care. I mean, he was going to teach his class, and that was more important than anything that we were doing. So I said, this guy's a really tough-minded professor. And then when he spoke about economic reform and analysis of how his thinking had changed, and during the Cultural Revolution, he'd be quiet, it was really fascinating to see how strong he was in his convictions. And then I learned that Li Keqiang did his doctorate while he was running the Youth League, I think, under Li Yining as his professor. And I know for sure, not that I know for sure, but because of my experience with Li Yining, that he didn't give him an easy ride, that it was a tough program that he had, because it didn't matter to this guy. So that was just, when I learned that about Li Keqiang, I said, this guy, that's an interesting situation. One of my most interesting people that really will affect China a great deal in the future is Li Yuanchao. Li Yuanchao is now head of the organization department. He is very close to Hu Jintao, as most people know. Some people say second closest after Li Keqiang. He also is from Shanghai, so it's very interesting that he's from the Youth League. He had Youth League in Shanghai. He grew up there, so he really has great support. And he has focused very strongly on what democracy means and how can you create a democracy with one-party rule. And that, to our ears, is an oxymoron. That's like saying, how can you have it rain and not rain at the same time? Or how can you have a married bachelor? Impossible, full stop. Well, it's not in their way of thinking, and I'm going to come back to that. Fourth person I have interest about is Li Yuanchao, who is the propaganda minister, they would say director of the publicity department. A funny story to tell you. In this book, I have one page where I have a picture of Li Yuanchao, director of the publicity department of the CPC, and the president of CCTV, Zhao Li, the new president. And we have a Wiley representative here, but I could not get the publisher to make the picture of the president of CCTV smaller than the picture of the director of the publicity department. Because anybody looks at the director of the publicity department, that's like way down the list. President of CCTV is a giant thing. So they had the picture of the CCTV guy that size, and the picture was just the publicity department very, very small, which, is the CCTV guy is 2 levels below the propaganda minister. So that is the way they think. But here's an individual who we would ascribe to thinking of, how do I clamp the media down? How do I control ideology? And certainly that's part of his job. But the biggest part of his job is how do I expand the media? And it's really fascinating to me the vision that is now had in terms of the Chinese media as affecting so many things that are in. So I picked these two areas, things that are not ordinarily talked about, because everybody talks about the economy, of course, and human rights, etc. But I look at these two things. How does the Chinese leaders what does democracy mean in their way of thinking? And then what is the plans for the media? So I'd like to say something about each of those, and then we'll all talk together. Again, the constraints are there must be one-party rule. That is pretty universally believed by the Chinese leaders, even way down. That China is just not ready for multi-party systems. It would be highly inefficient at the time. They use even the financial crisis to justify a lot of that. And I think that there is some justification for that. I think over time there's a crossover point in which one-party rule becomes counterproductive because you can't eliminate corruption or even mitigate it too terribly without a free press. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that. But again, leaders think that there should be one-party rule, and yet they really do believe, in fact, not in words, that they want to have democracy in society. So how do you do that? And I think that the leadership are coming up with some very innovative ways to try to increase the level of popular governance and to increase transparency. And I put it this way: if you had a choice between a one-party system that was completely transparent — this is a thought experiment, like Einstein writing on a light wave — one-party system is completely transparent, or a multi-party system that was not transparent. If you had to choose, obviously multi-party with transparency is the best. If you had to choose between them, which would you choose? I would choose transparency, because that's the best thing. And a lot of things that China is trying to do today with experiments is to bring transparency to the process of governance. And one of the ways is this: when officials are being appointed, they put their names out in ministries or to the public and let people criticize them for a few months or weeks. Now, they recognize there could be people criticizing them unfairly, but they subject that to public scrutiny. When one of Liu Chao's proteges, Cho He, who we write about in the book, took over in Kunming as the party secretary, one of the first things he did is he published the phone numbers of every 800 officials in the city, told people to call them, and then put one of his teams to spot check, to call these people and pretend to be citizens, see if they answered their phone. So people are striving to try to introduce democracy because it really creates efficiency. Ambassador Platt, we were talking about that democracy is an efficient way to manage, and that's true. And the Chinese leaders keeping the one-party rule as sacrosanct. They are trying to figure out a few. I think Hu Jintao is that way, and Liu and Chao particularly is trying to figure out how they can make this happen. In the media, China has, as I said, just like in other areas, we want to have some of the strongest media companies in the world. Now, it seems so impossible when you think about all the constraints and where China is. But that is really a great desire. They want China's voice in the world to be heard stronger. And in order to do this, they are creating new kind of industrial structures. If you know China, every province has its own radio and television film group, its own book publishing company, and they're literally very provincial. So how then do you be able to create strong media companies? This is the challenge, and they're really looking forward to doing that. And we can talk a lot about that. But if we follow the development of the Chinese media and what's happening, I think what we will see is this very interesting experiment that China is trying to do. Because as you try to improve the media, you cannot just do it one way. It's iterative. It will affect how they think as well. So, I would watch these two areas in addition to the obvious economics. The concept of democracy as they see it and how those steps are going, and the development of the media.
Thank you. want to stand up
Oh,
and
sure.
take some time?
Okay, sure.
I'll use the chair's prerogative to ask the first question, which is a simple one. Why you? In other words, what was it here? You hadn't studied China. You were a scientist. You know, you were a banker, and yet you have been granted this extraordinary access. What? Tell us the process. Tell us how you kind of retain that access.
That's a question that will not make me look smart, because it is not something that I planned. I had no interest in China. My background was in science and in business. In the late 1980s, because I was a scientist and I was an investment banker, I was invited. Story goes back a little bit. In the early 80s, I was nominated to be the dean of the business school at the University of Texas at Austin by the previous dean, who was a scientist and an investment banker. He was founder of a company called Teledyne. And he and I got to know each other. I came in second, and so I lost, but he and I became good friends. And so I became like a senior fellow, and we worked together. And it so happened that he was a close friend. You wanted to know? This is how it happened. And he was a close friend with a man named Song Jian, who at that time was the chairman of Gujarat Kuwait, the State Science and Technology Commission, which is really a czar of all science and technology in China for about 15 years. And they wanted to understand how you bring reform to the science industries in China. So I was invited by Song Jian and this Dr. George Kosmetsky to lecture to China. And when I went over, I was sort of taken by it. And then literally 3 months later was Tiananmen Square, and I wouldn't go back, as many wouldn't, very angry with the government. And 15 months later, I was chairing a conference on creativity and bureaucracies at UCLA, and I happened to invite one of the managers from the middle-level guys in the science industries to come there. And when he came there, later turned out to be UN Counselor for Science and Technology, me and a couple other people kind of started attacking him as being responsible for Tiananmen Square, which was very unfair because he wasn't, obviously. But he made a comment and then changed my life. He said, the problem in China today, which was in 1990, we're going backwards, but it's more your fault pointing to me than my fault pointing to him. I said, what does that mean? I'm not even there. And he said, that's exactly the point. You and everybody like you have abandoned us, and therefore going in the wrong direction. So I said I would go back. And then during the 90s, I would just work on things, and we did this documentary for PBS, and it was nothing was done for business purposes. It was sort of my vacation. And in that process, I got to know people, and people over a long time. I didn't have an agenda, just to learn and to sort of enjoy the process. And and then in the process of beginning to do the biography, or wanting to do the biography of John Smith, I sort of approached it like I'm not a writer, I'm not a journalist. I do these other things, and so I'm writing like as a scientist. And over time, it sort of has developed, and it's you take a step in the fog, and if you don't fall in a pothole, you make progress.
Well, I have a lot of other questions, but let me open the floor to questions. Professor Cohen.
In every communist system, there's a question of what it takes to get to the top of the leadership, and then what do you do if you make it? In the Soviet experience, no one expected Khrushchev, once he reached power at the 20th Party Congress, to denounce Stalin. He'd been one of Stalin's monkeys on the way up.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody thought Gorbachev, despite his legal training, would do what he did with respect to perestroika. You don't know in a system like that. Now, looking at the Chinese system, we didn't know what Jerome G would do in staking his career on reform of the economic system. And I'm interested in the question of leadership and attitude towards civil and political rights. You don't get to the top of the Chinese system by being soft on civil and political rights. Nevertheless, bubbling up in China is an increasing series of overlapping elites that would like to see greater responsiveness from the high leadership. And the high leadership so far hasn't responded. And they don't seem to know how to respond, and the 17th Party Congress has been a setback. Looking at the 18th as you are, I wonder whether you could say something. You mentioned Li Keqiang. You didn't point out, of course, what people know, which is that he's a Peking University undergraduate, and the only one we've seen in the Politburo. Could you say something about Bo Xilai or any of the others? Do you see any signal that somebody might be willing to respond to the bubbling up demands for more humane civil and political rights?
Well, I greatly respect your thoughtfulness. You've had a wonderful contribution to much of what good stuff has been happening in China over the years. I would probably love to argue a little bit with you on some of your comments, which I'm sure you would enjoy. I'm not. I would not say the 17th Party Congress was a setback. I think that we have a too narrow definition of what democracy is from the Chinese.
Civil and political rights, not democracy and not broader.
Okay. But I think they're intertwined. I think they're intertwined in terms of how you look at the totality of society, because I think they both sit on a deeper idea, and the deeper idea is the public participation in the process of governance, and the way to understand the thinking is one-party rule is absolutely sacrosanct because anything else would lead to instability. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that's how they think. So that's nothing to do with the communist ideology anymore. I think we all know that. But it really has to do with one-party rule. That is an absolute. And so a lot of things then follow from that in terms of how you deal with a dissident or the free press and things like that. But if you look at how the leaders currently are thinking and the attitude towards the rule of law, towards the concept of democracy as they would see it, the 17th Party Congress might not have gone as far as we might like, but I do think it expressed Hu Jintao's desire to, within the confines of keeping one-party rule, to improve all of the things that you're stating. Li Wenchao told me right after that, right after he was appointed to the Politburo and head of the organization department, that if in 5 years, till the 18th Party Congress, he does not improve the people's perception of the quality of the leaders that they have, that he would resign. That's what he said. And it was a very deep commitment to try to do that and to try to inculcate into the party system a greater degree of oversight and transparency. Now, there are a lot of ways that they talk about doing it with party congresses and not having the party committees be so, like emperors in local areas, and get people using media in a very limited way, not criticizing high level, but criticizing local level. So there are a lot of things that are happening that are leading to what you call for in terms of the elements of a civil society. And so I look for almost all of the leaders that are coming in the next generation to really believe that, but not to believe that in place of what there's nobody there that I can tell you or confidentially, is looking to be another Gorbachev to undermine one party, because Gorbachev wasn't trying to do that. I mean, if he knew in advance what he was doing, he wouldn't have done it. And people are very sensitive to that in China. But I think everyone coming, and you mentioned Bo Xilai, absolutely, really feel, and I would put Li Wenchao as a very strong participant in that, in terms of creating things, first in the party called this intra-party democracy, in the party itself, to bring that kind of democracy. So I would believe over time you're going to gradually have more and more real democracy within the party.
The appointments that have been made not only at the top, but lower down in the political legal agencies are increasingly retro. These are people who are party apparatchiks who are squeezing out the people who really are more rule of law sensitive. And that hasn't been noticed.
Yeah, I have heard that too, and I think that very well can be right. And again, if I would analyze that, I would say that it perhaps is attacking left, not attacking, attack like a sailboat, attacks left in preparation for leadership change, because they can't be in a position to be in any way looking soft on these kinds of things to protect the party. They must get their position, and they must let some time go by for consolidation in that position. I mean, I wouldn't look for a dramatic change until the second term of the next leaderships.
That's what we hope for from Hu Jintao.
And that's correct. I think there's there are reasons that didn't occur that have to do with political reasons. And Hu Jintao was probably not as flexible as vis-a-vis his previous administration as President Obama is a distance from George W. Bush. I'd say the system there is not quite the same.
Just a question on the transparency matter. We think of transparency as a means to an end, not an end in itself. The end is accountability. And what I'm wondering is, in terms of the way the Chinese leaders think about transparency, do you think they are aware that unless the population is completely docile, which doesn't appear to be the case, that they're going to have to confront, as they confront transparency, accountability, which means the ability by democratic means to remove the leadership?
Well,
and that means that it can't be within just a one-party system.
Well, what their challenge is to do exactly that, to square the circle, to do it within a one-party system. And the way you do that is you don't do it at the very top. You do it at lower levels. So I think what is being instituted now, certainly again by Liu Chao, because he runs the organization ministry, because that affects all the appointees, which in China is so critical, is that they really are doing accountability, and that he has said that a stable, good manager is not necessarily a good manager.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that the expectations are going to run beyond.
Well, that may be true, and that's what happens in society. Although China, the Pew study, I'm all familiar, showed that China had, in terms of the people in urban areas, had a very high satisfaction level with the government compared to other countries. So the pressures will build up, but I don't think the pressures will be like the Tiananmen kinds of pressures. They'll be driven by other kinds of things. Over time, who knows? But I don't look for dramatic pressure from below to create differences, to create dramatic changes at the top. I think enlightened people at the top will be making changes that are still maintaining one-party rule, but bringing a sense of the transparency which will lead to accountability, but that accountability will have a ceiling, and the ceiling will be below the Politburo.
Our friend from the World Bank.
Robert, I suspect you would agree that not every single China leader thinks identical.
Sure.
We cannot say probably it's very difficult to think that there is 1.4 billion Chinese thinking identical, right?
Sure. That's one of the points we like to make. Yeah.
Okay. So I haven't had the pleasure to read before, but from the type, I would say you're suggesting that this is how the Chinese leaders think. What I would like to suggest, what I would like to ask, rather, is the following. You alluded to the fact that the Chinese leaders are becoming to come from different educational backgrounds. They may have different, maybe family history, background, etc. Assuming that they're thinking somewhat differently, what other factors in your research, in your work, has shown that determining differences in thinking among the Chinese leadership, apart from possibly education and family background?
Well, I think you have a wonderful example of during the financial crisis in Guangdong with Wang Yang. I spent a week with him, and there was actually a difference of opinion that even reached into the Chinese media. And it seemed like Wang Yang was in an extreme position, because he was saying, you know, I am thankful for the financial crisis because it's forcing us to do what we should have done anyway, and we wouldn't have never done, because the export business and cheap labor and all that and is it's easy, and we would continue doing it. The financial crisis is forcing us to rethink and re-engineer our whole society and go to innovation and move the manufacturing inland and recreate everything else. And he was criticized for that by some leaders in Beijing, and there was some public, disputing back and forth, and then, they sort of made up with trips and things like that. So I mean, there is, which I thought was a very healthy development, that very definite differences of opinion of how to react to the financial crisis. Do you put all your resources into just propping up all the mom and pop toy companies that keep employment going, or do you let them go bankrupt and put your money into other kinds of things and try to do value-added businesses? So I mean, that's one way. That's one dimension, one axis of differentiation of thinking. How to allocate resources in terms of the trade-offs in pure economics between development and pollution, between coastal and inland, and do you drive the whole country more by feeding the areas that are going to work, or do you try to rebalance the social imbalances and social structure by investing more? I mean, leaders definitely differ in how they think that. They don't differ on whether there should only be one party. That's for sure. They probably do differ, although it's not discussed at all, in how much they really believe in sort of some of the socialist underpinnings of the party. There probably is some differences of thinking. I've had some very confidential conversations, but not a difference on whether there should be one party, but a difference on some people really do still have a belief in the socialist way of thinking, or some Marxist kind of thinking, which is fine.
What makes those differences to happen? In a sense, what kind of background, differences in background, or what kind of education they may have had that makes those kind of differences?
I'm not sure one can attribute it to some generic, just as an individual basis as it comes up. When you get to that level of leaders, there's there are different factions in the party that I call proto-democratic, proto-political parties. In the past, they always like to show the whole party's unified and everything's unified, and whenever there's a hint of dispute, that's supposed to, very secret and very, very bad, and you shouldn't talk about that. And I said, hey, that's good. You should talk about that, because that's encouraging. You have more political parties, and it's like a proto-political party. So you have differences of opinion within the party. More market, more government, how to allocate resources to different places, and that will develop over time. I don't think you can say, though, that one group, is more educated, or the lawyers, or the people in social sciences. I think the differences are that I would see right now among the next generation of leaders is very individually based. I mean, some are so-called allied with Hu Jintao's Youth League, some with Jiang Zemin's Shanghai group in a way, but that's kind of overly simplistic analysis that a lot of people do. I don't think that's entirely accurate. And then people who are the technocrats. I always loved Zhu Rongji's answer when he was asked which faction he belongs to. He says he belongs to the Tsinghua faction. So that's the university.
Question on the book was published in Chinese before it was published in English. What is not in the Chinese version? What did they take out?
The story is, I would go back to the biography of President John, because in that book, we sort of made the deal that they can take out whatever they want, which or wouldn't be published, but they couldn't change anything I said. And so in that book, I had 15 pages on Tiananmen Square, which is obviously critical in his career path, right? Couldn't avoid that. And so I had 15 pages, and I thought I had a very balanced view. I worked very hard and did all the research. I did it. And in the Chinese version, that was 15 pages was replaced by not a paragraph, not a sentence, but a phrase, and then events happened.
And they didn't change it. That was it.
No, they asked my fiction to include that. I didn't have that statement. They took my 15 pages and changed it to that one statement. So that's an extreme case. The current book, what I did was, because we had these 2 books in planning, I gave a very large manuscript because I didn't, it was a joke, it's not a joke, I didn't have time to write a shorter one, I was under such pressure. So I just gave basically the second draft. It wasn't, And so the Chinese took out from that what they thought was relevant for their market, which included a lot of censorship. So stuff on Tiananmen Square, anything about political disputation among the leaders. Also, a little bit of the, my extreme negativism about Mao and what he did was not included.
The religion chapter.
The religion chapter was I believe fairly that was included in the Chinese version. I have to check to be sure, but I think it was. I need to make one point before I forget, though, that in anything I've written in English, in all the time I've been in China, or the documentaries I've done, never once has any Chinese official or anybody asked to see ahead of time, not just not to censor what I write in English, but never even to look at it ahead of time. They look at it afterwards, but no one has even looked at it or asked to look at it ahead of time. The only thing they would ask to do is if I quote them with direct quotes, a few senior leaders have asked to send, after we do the transcript, to send their direct quote to them, and then sometimes they re-edit their direct quote, which is, that has been acceptable.
But your book is pro-leadership. I mean, there's no, when you look at a lot of the individual details in it, your description of Tiananmen, your description of, in fact, you then add, you believe that only hundreds of people, you say there's a dispute as to how many died, but you say you believe there were only hundreds of people. With respect to the melamine, controversy, you talk about the openness, but you don't point out that it was delayed for weeks and weeks because of censorship. That lives could have been saved, but the folks wouldn't allow publication early on. So it's issues like that which I think that the policy community, you talk about the Sichuan earthquake, and you say this was revolutionary. We allowed the open media, which is absolutely true. But what you don't then talk about is it reversed in 14 days, and that people have been imprisoned for trying to organize groups. So that's, nobody has censored anything, but it seems to me that the book has a very pro-leadership bias.
What I am trying to do is to not write an analysis as much as give the thinking of the Chinese leaders. Because I'm not trying to be, occasionally I will, but I'm not trying to I'm trying to allow you to hear what they think. So in the conversation about Sichuan, I'm giving what Wang Chen says. Wang Chen's the minister of the State Council Information Office. He's responsible for that. And he criticizes what people did in the past. He criticizes what China itself did in Tibet because he felt that was wrong, and therefore they made changes here and there. So I'm trying to add to the public debate what the leaders say themselves. And then you are free to make your analysis. I think that's terrific. And so what I want to do is to allow that to become part of the public debate, to allow the leadership to say how they think about what they think and why. And and I have no hesitation to put anything like that. I mean, I wasn't aware of what happened after 14 days. If I was, I would have put it in. I mean, I want to be as accurate as possible in terms of what the history is, obviously imperfectly, But in that context, I want to have what each leader says about his area to be exposed as much as possible. I mean, that's and to do it in areas that are not just the areas of common perception. The religion chapter that you mentioned is a very important one because it deals with one religious scholar and at that time the head of the State Administration of Religious Affairs, and see how they think about this. And they could talk about the history and shows their emotion and their thinking. I do it in internet censorship, where Simon Zhao was responsible for internet censorship, and we see one quote from him in the New York Times. He looks like a monster. All he's trying to do is close it down. Well, this tells his life story and why he says, I love the internet, and here's why we have to do censoring for a time. He gives this story as to why he censored. And the story is that, one example rather, and when some workers were laid off in the oil fields in the north, Daqing or something, that they were able to give them 100,000 RMB severance pay. And then when other workers down south were laid off, they could only give them 1,000. And they were on the internet. There was starting to be a great deal of people being very upset. So he said, we censored that because it's a unique time and we have this transition. This won't happen forever. What I try to do, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that that's the way he thinks, and that's what I try to do. And you know, anything that I would know or that would be in the picture, I try to bring to. In that same chapter, I deal with the kinds of issues that came up that put officials under pressure. They seem to be minor here, but they seem to be almost funny. This paper tiger in Shanxi province, where somebody saw they had, where local officials try to make increase the tourism because they found a rare tiger. It turned out to be a fraud. In terms of the lip syncing at the Olympics, in terms of where senior leaders were involved. I mean, and these things were all exposed. The woman who killed her attacker and was going to be put in prison when she was being sexually attacked. I mean, these are things that has come up that is against the leadership, and they're, I think, wonderful and exemplary stories. And and the more that occurs, particularly, and that I think is a very strong force in society today. That the internet forcing them. Now, it's granted at lower levels, but I think a lot of the problems with product safety or things that are being hushed up are being done at the local levels. I mean, some like SARS was done at the senior level, and I deal with that and I explain that, but others are done at the local level, not at the senior level.
Are you fluent in Mandarin so you could do these interviews
No.
yourself?
No.
Who were your translators and what were their backgrounds?
No, my primary translator is who I write about in the book is somebody who, when I first went to China 20 years ago, was my translator and sort of chaperone. He's a young kid in his early 20s, fluent in English. He defected after Tiananmen Square because he was in Tiananmen Square, came to the U.S., earned an MBA. I hired him in my company in 1994, and he's been with me ever since. He's now been his own career. He's a senior investment banker as well, but on all political things, he does my translating. So he's very, very, very smart guy, graduate of U.S. MBA plus Harbin Institute and Masters in Linguistics, and fluent in several languages. Very smart guy.
One time for one last question, Ambassador Platt. Make your short one.
I think it's really important to know what these guys think, and I think this book will help us learn something about that. But what I want to know is who's doing the thinking forward. Democracy is something that they're thinking about. It's a word that's been in all of the party documents since the beginning, and it's taken on very different meanings. But my sense of it is that no one is really trying to figure out what democracy can do for them. The devolution of responsibility is a major management concept. And when you have an insistence on party rule or party control over everything, it means that every problem that comes up is yours, and you have to deal with it. Is somebody doing some thinking within the party system about how to use democracy to help them relieve the burdens and the pressures on them?
And I think that's a great idea. I think the answer is yes, but they need to do more. The development of NGOs has been a sensitive area. They've gone back and forth on that. They're nervous because they blame NGOs for the color revolution in Eastern Europe. So that NGOs are always have a concern in terms of party rule. But I think that they recognize that the party can't do it, and they have to have other mechanisms in society like NGOs to work the system. I also think that the growth of like large corporations is actually helping the pluralism of society, because remember when Sinnock tried to buy Unical, we had a big political thing in the United States against that, because the government owned Sinnock, the offshore oil company. But if you really know how that works, is that these large corporations are becoming power centers in their own right, and even though they're owned by a ministry, so to speak, or report to a ministry, they really have a lot of independence. And so the pluralism society will happen as you have these independent centers. On the one hand, the internet at the lowest possible level, the blogosphere, and the other different corporations that become power centers in their own right. But the development of NGOs, I think, is a critical element in that process. And then some of these, kind of odd and extreme things, like what Choha is doing in Kunming, and just kind of opening up and let the people, call whoever they want in the government all the time. I mean, sort of odd things that you do, but at least people are thinking about, in a one-party system, how do you do what you're saying? Because I think the answer is that there are some people starting to think that way, and as I said, Li Wenchao was somebody that I would put at the top of that list.
We've reached the appointed hour, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to see everyone.